Christian stories. It was a beautiful day. The spring March sun was already warming up noticeably, and everyone seemed to be happy about it. Everyone except Pasha. He did not care about the sunshine, even the merry chirping of birds did not cheer the boy up. He walked sadly with a drooping head, stopping from time to time and idly looking around. The heavy knapsack slung over his shoulder seemed even heavier from his heavy thoughts. And the heaviest burden for Paul was the diary, which flaunted a polite invitation to Pasha's parents to come to school. "Hey, Pashka, why did you hang your head?" suddenly shouted at my ear classmate Boris. I call you, but you do not hear. I could hardly catch up with you." Paul stopped and looked indifferently at Boris, and then waved his hand and said carelessly, "Leave me alone." "Listen," Boris fussed from one side to the other, "are you upset about this remark? Don't worry, it'll be all right, let's go to the computer club, let's play." "I don't want to," muttered Pasha and walked faster. "And you hide the diary, or tear out a page," did not retreat Borja. "I, for example, in such cases, I ask my grandmother for help. She loves me. She doesn't say anything to my parents, and she goes to school herself. When the teacher groans and sighs, threatens to punish me, but as soon as she goes out the door, so begins to complain that the children in our time in school's utterly tortured, and that the guys have no childhood. And that was the end of it. Until the next time, of course." Boris stopped talking and looked at Pasha expectantly. "Well, shall we go in?" he asked. "I can even lend you money." "I already owe you," Paul grinned bitterly. "Big deal," exclaimed Boris. "Nothing is sacrificed for your best friend." Paul stopped and looked at Borja incredulously. "And what does he want from me?" he thought. "After all, he knows that my parents do not allow me to go there." "Well, okay," Pasha said thoughtfully, "just one last time. One more time won't change anything. I've done enough wrong already." Just as the boys were about to enter the clubhouse, a red-headed dog jumped out of nowhere with a loud bark and pounced on Pasha. He cried out in pain and kicked the dog with his foot. The dog squealed and, with his tail between his legs, took off running. And Paul, squatting down and clasping his hand to the wound on his leg, groaned. What happened next, Paul vaguely remembered, because when he saw the blood, almost lost consciousness. But he remembered that some woman brought him home and that his mother began to call somewhere, then an ambulance arrived and he was taken to the emergency room. It was only in the evening, comfortably ensconced on the couch with a bandaged leg, that Pavel was able to make sense of what had happened. Seeing his briefcase slid behind the piano, the boy realized that no one would be looking into it anytime soon. He would have to spend the next week or two at home, and then the vacations would come. Maybe the teacher would forget that he had called his parents. Throughout his illness, the boy was surrounded by special care and concern, and apart from the injections the doctor prescribed, Pasha liked being sick. Dad constantly brought him different fruits for the general strengthening of the body, his mother baked Pasha's favorite pastries, and he was exempted from housework. What a life! Except that sometimes the boy was reminded of his secret affairs and that remark in his diary. His heart was heavy and sad. "How can I make it so," thought the boy, "that I don't have these problems?" And then one day, on the fourth or fifth day after what had happened, Paul, limping, went into his father's study and, sitting in his chair, began to look at his father's manuscripts and notes lying on the table. What struck the boy's eye were the lines his father had written. And the following was written, "And man applies sin to sin, sin to sin. And if he does not stop himself, God will stop him." For the first time in all this time Paul thought that the incident with the dog was the very stop that God had made for him. Interested in what he had written, the boy read on, "If a man thinks that unrepentant, hidden sin is the only sin in his life, he deceives himself. Unrepentant sin will lead to other sins. So it is," Paul thought, "it's all written about me." Eager to get to the bottom of it, the boy continued reading, "And if a man does not repent and confess, his soul will perish." Conversation with his father. "Lord," Paul whispered in terror, "it is I who must repent and confess. I do not wish to go to perdition." In the evening, when his father returned, Paul waited until he had retired to his study, and then he went to the door, knocked timidly, and opened it. Sitting at the desk, the father turned his head and, seeing his son, asked sympathetically, "Is there something you want?" Yes, Paul answered quietly, I want to confess. Confess? Paul asked his father, raising his eyebrows in surprise. Pasha nodded his head. Limping, he went in and sat down. This dark-haired boy can hardly tell you of a more intimate conversation with his father and of a more fervent prayer of his youth than that which was uttered that memorable evening. Paul wept without wiping away his tears as he recounted his transgressions to his father and to God. He told of the first time he had stepped into a computer club and trampled on his conscience. How he had skipped school so he could stay in the club longer. How he spent all his father's pocket money there. And how he once took money from his older sister Sophia. The hardest thing for Paul to admit was that one time he took money from his father's purse. By opening his heart in confession, Paul understood that he was worthy of punishment and was already morally preparing to accept it. But it was not the thought of punishment that troubled his heart now. He was afraid that his father would no longer trust him and love him as he had before. But no, it was not at all what the boy thought it would be. I am glad, said the father, that you have come and confessed to everything. By putting sin to sin, one becomes estranged from God and one's relatives and friends, while a sincere heart receives a blessing and gains friends. Of course, the father forgave his son, and God forgave him and gave him an invaluable gift and strength with which to face any temptation.